Now, all day we've heard about a pretty grim catalog of inequities, the impact of intergenerational trauma, etc. Where do you start with all this? What do you address first?
Well, like any,
I think you'll turn.
it'll turn on all by itself. I'm not sure that there is a first. I think we each need to find our own roles and responsibilities within the response. Some of you talked earlier about educating ourselves. I think for most Canadians, one of the first things we need to do is learn truth and educate ourselves, and that's an ongoing exercise. But I think, as I said in my talk, I actually think it is understanding that First Peoples were here before most of us came along, and that we settlers came and trampled on the rights of the peoples that were here before us, and set up a structure that was unfair and unjust. And I really believe that the addressing of the recognition of rights is one of the most fundamental pieces. But from there, we have to go to figure out the practical details. And I actually think that there is more than enough work for all of us to be able to do that. Part of it is having those conversations with the rest of the country, because the people in this room understand some of what justice should look like for Indigenous peoples, but we all interact every single day with lots of people that still need to be brought on board, because we will not resolve these inequities by only addressing it with the 5% of Canadians who are Indigenous. We need to, as Minister Bennett says, bring the other 95% along.
Now, when I talk about rights, when I hear this publicly, some people come back to me and say, well, you can't eat rights. You know, there's kids going hungry, there's dirty water, there's no sewage. What about the practical stuff?
Thank you for acknowledging that. In fact, that's very similar to what an elder once said to me. He said, words don't feed a table. And you're absolutely right. We need to deal with a lot of the practical things. The really good news is that, in an upstream model, part of the reason we all believe in upstream is that, in fact, we can do better if we work further upstream in very practical ways by addressing things like housing. And I'll just give you a simple example of what I think is just the most incredible way that sometimes the right solution will actually solve problems, save money, and help people do better. So in Edmonton, the Métis Nation of Alberta has a housing corporation which went to some of the Alberta Child and Family Services organizations and said, if we bring families together, if we take single moms and bring their kids back to them, and we take the money that you would normally pay to have those children in foster care, and we use it instead, in fact, we'll take less money than what you'd pay to have those kids in foster care, and we're going to use that to renovate an apartment building and bring families together. It's a bit of a long story, but the amazing news is that they were able to cost the Alberta government less money and reunify families, renovate an apartment building where they were able to have 24/7 social workers and support workers that allowed families to be able to get back together, get housed, and get themselves back on their feet. So these kinds of investments in those social issues like housing really will help to solve the practical issues.
And you've made me think. I visited Treaty 6 community recently in Saskatchewan, and I asked, what can the government do? The single one thing they could do to help you, and they said, get out of the way. Is there truth to that the bureaucracy is in the way, that you're not allowing people to express their self-determination?
For sure, we have not done a disservice by most of the approaches in the past, and to a certain extent, getting out of the way is the right thing to do. My own department has a plan to get out of the way. But, we also have obligations, and many of those are fiduciary obligations that we have by way of treaties that we have signed, but also by way of being the federal government of the land. But you're absolutely right. That is, the sooner that we can put people in charge of their own lives, that's always going to be better. And we really are seeing great examples of that in many, many cases across the country. You look at the school system that the Mi'kmaq have developed in Nova Scotia, where when the federal government stood back and said, you know, here's the money that you need and you guys run your own educational system, they brought the standards up to the fact that their graduation rates are better than the average in Nova Scotia now. And it was not because the federal government did anything, it was because the federal government got out of the way.
Now, here we're preaching to the converted on reconciliation, but how do you sell these issues to a broader public when you have 1,000 other things they want the government to deal with? Do you push it as a human rights issue, as an economic issue, as a justice issue? How do you sell this to the public that, you know, frankly doesn't care?
That's perhaps the royal question of the day, and maybe there's people here who have a better answer. I think listening to stories like Jesse's story today, I want to blast that out to, if Jesse will let us, because people hear that and start to understand that maybe their way of looking at these inequities was not quite right, and that there's another way to look at things. Sometimes we have to make the crass economic case for people, and for people to realize that actually doing the right thing is better for all of us in the end. And there's lots of good examples of where, you know, when First Nations are given fair opportunities to thrive, that it actually improves not just the health and well-being of their community, but they actually contribute tremendously to the economy. So that's part of the answer, but I think that the others out here probably have more answers to contribute.
And we talked about that earlier, how inequality is bad for all of us. It's not just bad for Indigenous people.
Absolutely.
Okay. So a question from the audience. The question is what do we use as a measuring stick? How do we know we're making progress on these issues? They're big, sweeping issues. What's the measure, and how do we know we're getting somewhere?
Wow, that's another great question. You know, I think there are multiple measuring sticks, and again, this is, you know, we're not in a world where a federal government should be deciding what the measuring sticks are. That's a lesson that, you know, we've learned. Some of it, you know, is going to be done by looking at some of the data that you apparently shared this morning when I wasn't here to learn from you. Some of it will be from those objective data sources. Some of it will be looking at how we've responded as a society to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But really the measurement, you know, of how Indigenous peoples are doing, or First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, has to be decided by them, for them. We've been told, for example, in looking at educational outcomes, it's not the government's business through Treasury Board to be deciding, you know, what we're going to be measuring, and First Nations will decide for themselves what success looks like as they have education by First Nations for First Nations. Some have looked to international measures, and so Sustainable Development Goals has been proposed by many to be a more objective way of looking at whether we're successful. But, you know, when we know that when you were born in the country of Canada or come to the country of Canada, that your race, ethnicity, cultural background doesn't actually make a difference in terms of your opportunity to be able to have a happy, healthy, and meaningful life, then I guess we'll know we've succeeded.
Now, does the government, you go through the TRC list and do check marks? Are you able to check any off yet?
Well, I would say many of them are not necessarily things where you reach completion and stay there forever. So they are an ongoing exercise. Minister Bennett, in her portfolio, actually does have the responsibility to track all of them, and she's then divided them up. So I have certain ones that fall under my portfolio. I think there's been progress initiated on almost all of them, but it will take some time for them to be accomplished completely. But I think they're a fantastic way for us to be able to look and see as to whether we're actually making progress. But, you know, the first 5 of them deal with what I was talking about there, child welfare, and it's taken us a lot of generations to get into the mess we're in, and it's not something where we'll be able to reduce those numbers overnight.
Now, we make a lot of demands on you. We, all day we've heard the government should be doing this and doing that. So I want you to turn the tables and tell advocates what they can do to make your job easier, to sell this at cabinet, to sell it to the public.
Okay, there we go. Boy, this is a great opportunity. No one's ever given me this opportunity before. 2 minutes to tell.
Time's up.
I think there's a real balance for advocates and activists to try to figure out how you can continue to push government, but do so in a way that's constructive, which is, I think, sometimes challenging. I mean, I think I've said maybe even at this meeting before once, to hold me to account in my particular role. So I think it's often helpful to sort of raise the cry of the public in terms of addressing these issues. But I think it's what you talked about earlier, is that this is the converted here in the room in terms of the fact that we need to invest in reconciliation. We've got a lot of work to do to share these ideas with our friends and neighbors and colleagues who are not yet convinced that this is the top priority issue for Canada. So I would say, again, hosting as many opportunities or venues where we can continue to educate ourselves as a society about our true Canadian history and how we got into such serious socioeconomic inequality in this country. And as we start to understand more of what that looks like, then I think it will help us to be successful, because then we'll have 36 million people telling us to do the right thing instead of, a few people gathered on occasions like this.
Now, the way of government is incrementalism. We do a little bit at a time. That's practical. It's kind of the Canadian way. Is incrementalism good enough in this file?
Wow, it makes me think, we're all remembering Martin Luther King this week on the anniversary of his assassination, and, he talks about, in terrible terms, about incrementalism and calls it, the most serious foe of the kind of reconciliation that he was facing, racial reconciliation in his time. I think, as much as possible, if we can find ways to do things rapidly, all the better. I say to chiefs now when I meet with them, I said, imagine if you were a chief and I were a politician in the 1960s in the height of residential schools, what would we do knowing what we know now? We would say, shut down the doors of those schools, send those kids home, don't bring one more child to residential school because it's horrible. So what's the modern day equivalent of that? How can I, walk into Women's Hospital in Winnipeg and say, stop it, just stop taking babies. Figure out another way that you can resolve the fact that you're worried about the safety of this child. And you actually can't take that baby until you've proven to me that there's absolutely no other way that we can keep that child safe. So, that's a hue and cry that we should be raising, to say, stop taking babies from their mothers. There have got to be less disruptive ways. There have got to be less traumatic ways of dealing with protecting the safety of children and families. So if we can leap ahead and not be incremental, that would be fantastic.
And one last question. We have 1 minute. When your term is up, when the election comes around, what is going to be your measure of success? How are you going to say, I've succeeded in this impossible portfolio?
I think the measure of success will be from other people. One of the most heartwarming things I heard last week when I met with some of the chiefs in Manitoba was when one of them said to me, you're one of the first politicians that's actually said you would do stuff and then you've actually done it. And I often hear how people don't trust me and don't trust the government, and I say, we don't deserve your trust, actually. We have to earn that trust. So, I think Canada's First Nations, Inuit, and Métis will have to decide whether or not we've done what we said we were going to do and whether we've been fair and worked every day to try to resolve these issues. So hopefully somebody will think that I did something I said I was going to do.
Great. Well, thank you again, Minister, for all the time, for the engagement, and for reminding us again to always hold your feet to the fire. So I think they'll do so.